Good morning, dear friends. Holy, holy Yidden. It is Thursday, kicking and screaming. 4th of Adar 2, March 14th, studying the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. Presently, Pesachim, chapter 7, page 76a, turning to 76b. Well, maybe tomorrow, but 76a. We are in the midst of talking about how to prepare the Carbon Pesach. And the Carbon Pesach must only be cooked sli'esh with fire, and therefore, if the meat is exposed to other forms of cooking, that meat would be disqualified, would have to be removed, which leads us to a broader kashrus kind of question. We call this halachic food sciences, take it or leave it, and we're going to continue to discuss what we started yesterday, which is a question of if you expose two foods, a kosher food to a non-kosher food, or a cold food, or a milk food to a meat food. We know that flavor is exchanged by heat. So two hot items touch each other, we automatically assume they've exchanged flavor. So if it's a kosher item and a non-kosher item, the non-kosher item has managed to impart unkosher flavor into the kosher item, thus causing it to be disqualified. If we're talking about milk and meat, as we know, milk and meat must not be eaten together. And if the two hot items touch each other, there's an exchange of milky flavor into the meat and meaty flavor into the milk, thus causing it to be unkosher. The question arises, the question we saw yesterday and we'll explore a little further today is when we're dealing with a hot and cold item. Which one overpowers the other? Does the hot cause the cold to become hot, or does the cold cause the hot to be cold? I want to clarify. Yesterday, I was trying to be cute, so I was talking about mac and cheese falling into a pot of chicken soup. That was, for the purposes of broad exposure, may have been helpful, but it was actually cutesy at the expense of clarity. So I should really redefine. For simplicity's sake, let's assume we're talking about two solid substances, one that's milchig, one that's fleshig, or one that's kosher, one that's unkosher, and they just happen to fall one on the other. So talk about a kosher steak and an unkosher steak. If there's two grills, and this could happen actually, because you go to the park and you have those little grills, and suppose you kosher your grill, or you brought your own grill, or somehow you figured out that it should be kosher, and your neighbor is also grilling, and things happen. The kids are playing around, and before you know it, his beautiful ribeye is smack on top of your beautiful ribeye. The only problem is his beautiful ribeye is unkosher, your ribeye is kosher. Now what do you do? And that's effectively the question, and the whole exploration will be which one is on top, which one is on bottom, the opinion of Rav, the opinion of Shmuel, and there are many other factors that obviously need to be considered, some that will be addressed in the Gemara, and some that will not be addressed in the Gemara. How hot is hot?
That's my question.
Yeah.
And how cold is
cold? And you can have something that's frozen, and you have. I'm sorry, doctor. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's exactly what I want to know. There's a big difference between something not being hot but being warm. There's a big difference between something not being cold but being room temperature. So if a hot hamburger falls on top of a frozen trafe hamburger, it's frozen, it's cold. But if it's on one that was thawed out and is room temperature, it certainly transfers the flavor from a hot kosher hamburger to that trafe one. So, but nowhere do you really talk about that.
So we're not going to explicitly give those definitions here. What I can tell you is that in the Code of Jewish Law and the commentaries that are halachically oriented, who probe over our Gemara, there are some differences of opinion. We get a better definition of hot than cold. Hot is something that was removed from the fire, perhaps still in the original pan, and it's still the type of heat that you can't, when you touch, you withdraw your hand. Yad soledes. And so we're talking about a scalding level of heat. Cold, I haven't seen such helpful definitions, and so let's keep our eyes peeled. But that's a very fair.
Rabbi.
Yes.
Once our eyes are peeled, you have the whole issue with those things happening in a microwave.
Yeah. So let me tell you something. In the Code of Jewish Law, there's a massive section called Basar v'chalav, milk and meat. And there are exhaustive discussions about precisely this whole subject. When the introduction of milk and meat to one another, their temperature, their heat, quantities. Is it liquid? Is it solid? Is it oily? Is it greasy? Can it be rinsed off? Does it need to be peeled? Does it need to be burned? Is it biblical? Is it rabbinic? As you can imagine, the conversation can get very granular and very, very intricate. Our Gemara, we might consider a first exposure to the topic, and it's thankfully somewhat general, affording us exposure without being overly intimidated or overly overwhelmed by the intricacies and the details. And so this is actually a fantastic, let's call it a first taste of the discussion of milk and meat. And again, I want you to remember why and how we came here. This all was introduced to us because we're talking about the liquids of the carbon Pesach dripping and dripping back, or effectively an exchange of surfaces. We talked about smearing the carbon Pesach with oil. Is it cham? Is it kar? And so those are, there's going to end up being an interplay between the debate between Rav and Shmuel, which is Tato Gavar, Ila Gavar, is the dominant temperature impact, or is the one that does the one on the top have a greater effect on the temperature than the one on the bottom, or vice versa? And the Achronim get very into what exactly are they debating about? There is a factual exchange of temperature. You'll assume that they'll meet each other somewhere in the middle. So if something is overwhelmingly hot, it'll heat up the lukewarm thing. If something's very, very cold, it'll cool it down. And so some say that there's a statistical question of the number of times that such an exchange would happen, which one will cool the other one off. Again, I don't know if direction or weight, in fact, in modern science or, how do you call it? In modern sense, if it actually has any bearing on the weight. But there's an interesting conceptual conversation about if the host, if the landing spot, which is stationary, might have a greater influence, or if directionally in position, or how do you call it, reverberation or weight, if that has any effect. So we could imagine different ways of understanding or reasons why you might have this debate. Let's try to have an open mind and try, because there are a lot of questions that naturally emerge from our life experience. Let's try to have an open mind in that. Let's try to hear what the Gemara is saying, and then we can line up what we understand with the Gemara's sentiment, and we may or may, well, who knows? The sky's the limit, and you never know what we'll emerge with. But that's the Gemara. I'm going to share the screen, and again, it's going to be a fairly short discussion, but I think the introduction was necessary, and I hope you've allowed me to somewhat modify my bombastic presentation of a macaroni falling into a pot of chicken soup. That is a discussion that happens vastly in laws of kosher, but it is not really helpful for the specifics of our discussion today. So just to clarify, we're really talking about two solid items, one falling upon the other. Let's just review this. I do want to tell you one more thing. We're dedicating our learning for the members of the Chabura and for Klal Yisrael and for Good News from Israel. I want to mention Elio Sviben, Rabban Sipora, for a complete and speedy refuah. And of course, we're approaching the shloshim of our dear friend Yisrael Moshe ben Shmuel, and there's going to be something on Sunday. And Dr. Hammer, don't ask. I'm going to have something for you, but it's been an interesting delay. But we'll have something, and then we can always, anyways. But I was trying to find, and without much success, I wanted a good picture of the Chabura with maybe to see Dr. Passon. I didn't find what I was looking for yet, although I'm going to keep on looking. But I had a very, very.
I have one from the dinner from last year, from the luncheon.
No, I have from the dinner, but I was looking for a picture of. I was looking for a snapshot of the Zoom discussion. So it led me to go through some of the older classes, and I had a lot of nostalgia, if that's the right word. It made me realize that we've been doing this for a significant amount of time, and sometimes we take people or things that we have a constant access to for granted, and to think that we had the privilege to spend so many hundreds of hours with each other. But I was thinking about Dr. Pasternak, and it's truly a special gift and something to cherish and hold on to. And anyways, you'll pardon me for getting a little sentimental here, but that was part of a thought process that I went through as I was trying to find when I was going through old shiurim. And so in the Neshama Shabbat Aliyah, we should have only good news for our Chabura.
Amen, amen.
All right, so here's the Gemara again, only a short period of time, but let's jump in. Itmar, this is the citation that we read yesterday. Cham l'toicham, if you have a hot solid kosher food falling onto a hot solid non-kosher food, or a hot solid milchig item falling into a hot solid fleshig item. By the way, I am struggling to think of the best example of a hot solid dairy item, because usually we think of it as runny, or if it's cheese or if it's milk, you imagine it's going to be liquidy, but liquidy or stringy, but I'm sure we can come up with something. Also, they are prohibited because they've had a total exchange of the flavors, and now the kosher item has absorbed unkosher. So if a cold item falls into a cold item, divrei hakol mutter. Of course, two cold items. If there's grease, you have to wash it off, as we'll see. But other than that, there's been no flavor exchange, no problem. But if a hot item falls on top of or upon a cold item, or a cold item falls into a hot item, Rav Amri la gavar, Shmuel Amar tata gavar. So Rav says we look at the temperature of the upper one. If it's cold, the whole thing is considered cold. If it's hot, the whole thing is considered hot. And Shmuel says we look at the host. We look at the receiving pot. By the way, an issue that's not mentioned over here, but I'm sure you'll get a kick out of this, is let's go back for a moment to my pasta analogy. What if the steak falls into a hot dairy pasta, but it sinks into it? So it's not just upon it, but it actually sinks. So it's emerged. Would there be a difference? Let's see. Or we're not going to see, but something to think about. Rashi's language, by the way, ilah gavar. I want to just read this again. Ha'elyon notseach. The upper one prevails and imposes its temperature upon the bottom one. Hilkach cham l'teich tzayin aser. So if the top one is hot, it becomes aser. Sheha'elyon mechamemoy l'tachtain. Before the bottom can cool the top heats up the bottom. And so for that moment, they're both considered hot, and there's a flavor exchange, and therefore it's aser. Shmuel says the bottom is dominant. Therefore, if the bottom one is cold, it's all mutter. Because, and here I guess is the real principle we need to consider, and I want to pause here for a second because I probably wasn't clear enough. For true non-kosher to occur, you need two hot counterparts exchanging flavor. One alone is insufficient. So really the question is, who wins the race? Will the cold manage to heat up the hot? Will the hot manage to heat up the cold, or will the cold cool down the hot? But we're not going to assume that they'll be in contact and they'll both remain the same. Dr. Hammer, your question remains a very important one. So at some point we're going to have to ponder that. But for the moment, should you want me to hold it? Okay. Okay, that's the Brisa. Very basic framework. Shmuel says the bottom dish dominates the temperature war. Rav says the higher falling dish dominates the temperature war. So if you're out at the park and your kids are running around, and your friend's steak goes flying in the air and lands on top of your ribeye, if your ribeye is cold and that steak just came off the grill, Shmuel says it's kosher. Rav says it's unkosher. Shmuel says we look at the kosher bottom steak, which is cold. It's cooled down the landing unkosher steak. And Rav says, oh, no, you look at the steak that's falling and it's hot and treif, and so therefore the whole thing is missed. That's Rav and Shmuel. Tanan. Notach miroitfai alacheres. Now we're revisiting our Korban Pesach conversation. If a little gravy drips onto the earthenware oven, the chazar love, and then drips back onto the Korban Pesach, yiteles mekayma, you need to remove the segment that the dripping happened. That's our mission. Now let's think this through, and you're going to think this is a little funny, but you're going to see it's a little helpful. Our initial understanding, the yeshiva or the Talmudic scholars said, let's assume we're talking about a cold earthenware. Well, let's understand this. According to Rav, The higher falling element is the stronger one that controls the temperature war. Mishum hachi ito mekaimai, and therefore you should remove the area where the splash fell. You know why? The azal roitav mirtach lecheres. The spritzing fats that were very hot heated up the earthenware. And then the hot earthenware walls somehow preserve that heat and reimpose heat into the same roitev. And now that the stuff spritzed back on the carbon Pesach, the heat of the cheres, which projected forth the spritzing fat, cooked the carbon Pesach. I know this sounds absurd, but let's hold it in our minds. There's some kind of rapid exchange of spritzing juices from the carbon Pesach, and we consider it hot enough to cook. And the Torah, of course, says that it has to only be cooked by fire. So according to Rav, you could somehow envision a scenario that you might declare this right of hot. But Shmuel, who says we always look at the receiving end of the exchange. Cheres, if you drip some gravy on the cheres. Kiva the tzoininu, and the cheres is cold. Akore mekar le'leroitev, the cool cheres cools off the roitev. And therefore, if this roitev were to ever fall back on the carbon Pesach, it would have no cooking effect. So why should you ever have to remove anything? So the Gemara answers, and this is, I guess, where we're going to have to end, but it's a good point. Because in fact, Shmuel will tell you, our Mishnah is talking about that the receiving end of the spritzed roitev is hot. And so, of course, if the receiving end is hot, it's not going to cool down the gravy. And therefore, the gravy is going to heat it up. And that's what we're talking about over here. All right, folks, I'm sorry. That's a very short. I'm going to leave Mark as the... No, I can't. I'm sorry. We have to end this for all. Everyone have a wonderful day. Shkoyach. And thank you for your patience. Tomorrow, hopefully, we'll have a full day. Should only have good news.
Thank you, everybody.